Good afternoon. This is the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee. Today is Tuesday, April 15th at 2:28 p.m. We are continuing with our testimony on S-157. And with us, we have Bill Weinberg.
Thank you. It's great to be back with you. Was with you at that joint committee session early in the legislative session. Again, I come to this from a few perspectives. My current role is as the executive chair of this new organization, Let's Build Homes. I've got a little bit of an update for you on Let's Build Homes. I have also looked at these debates, 12 years serving as the mayor of Burlington. We grappled with a lot of the issues you guys were just grappling with in the testimony so far today. Before that, I was an affordable housing developer and took on these challenges from that role. And I am working with a few projects again now as a kind of advisor and sort of seeing what's going on out there with current Vermont housing projects. The coalition has grown since we last talked to you. I want to share we now have more than 200 organizations from all 14 counties in the state and over 700 individuals that have signed on to the Let's Build Homes letter, the call for trying to meet that goal that was referenced in the last presentation, about 30,000 homes being built over the next 5 years, a goal that will require a dramatic increase even from the modest uptick that we've seen in recent years. I'm excited to share that 200 organizations really does include an incredible range of different businesses, nonprofits, institutions, employers that would benefit from us addressing the housing scarcity that we have today, that would benefit from there being a lot more homes. This is the organizations have joined because they are hospitals that are struggling with workforce issues. We have businesses that are for years have been struggling to recruit and retain employees at all income levels because of the current housing shortage. It includes nonprofits like AARP, representing the older Vermonters, and groups like the Vermonters for People-Oriented Places, a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings that really want to stay here and are struggling to do so with the current acute housing shortage. This is what the sign-on letter essentially said, is that we, out of the box here, we're going to focus in these areas. I do just want to briefly mention, obviously, I'm here to talk to you about the infrastructure piece of it with this CHIP bill that we've been championing since the start of the session. We have been weighing in on the budget issues with respect to continued significant public investment in permanently affordable housing. That is a core principle of Let's Build Homes, is that we need to continue to make those investments. There are Vermonters that certainly need that and are going to need, no matter how successful we are with the increasing of the housing supply, that are going to need that kind of investment from the state. I think in that coalition, that 200 or plus organization coalition, many of the state's top affordable housing nonprofits are part of this coalition, knowing that this is a core value. What is different, I'll say again, I probably said this last time, what is different about Let's Build Homes than many past, I would say pretty much all past affordable discussions of housing in recent decades, is that we see this as a bigger conversation than just about permanent things. And we think we need to increase the amount of housing supply really for homes of all shapes and sizes and for all incomes and backgrounds in Vermonters. We think the strategy of just focusing on permanently affordable housing is not sufficient. And we know that from the level of homelessness that we currently face. We know that from the level of need, the level of rent burden that Vermonters face, with a quarter of Vermonters spending more than 50% of their income on rent and being very vulnerable. So this is a more expansive effort. We are following the debate and weighing in on the debate on appeals reform. It's our sense a lot of that conversation is going to happen in future years. We are starting to engage this Act 250 mapping effort that is actively happening in the RPCs around the state. And I'm happy to say we've already had a lot of engagement from municipalities that are I think sometimes, especially when you come from the state legislative perspective, it can be easy to think that that municipalities are kind of an obstacle to housing growth. And certainly there are municipalities that have an anti-growth mindset or want to really limit what can get built. There are many municipalities around the state, I'm happy to say, that are, at least now in 2025, understanding the severity of the challenge, really trying to think the other way. We've seen, just in the time we've been operating since January, we've seen Essex Junction pass significant upzoning citywide. We've had good engagement with municipalities from Montpelier to Woodstock to Shelburne on what they can do at the municipal level to go beyond what the state has required and have an impact. And we're going to keep doing that work. So, I appreciated the presentation you just received from the Joint Financial Office. I thought there was a lot of balance in the presentation and nuance. And one thing that Ted said that struck me as exactly right is, as policymakers, what you choose to do here should come down to how severe you think this housing crisis is. If you are content with maybe getting back to levels that were just before the Great Recession, maybe you can look at the recent data and see some signs that we're on the trajectory there. Let's Build Homes comes from the perspective that we have a deep problem here, that we have been digging a hole that we've been digging deeper for decades now. If you compare the current level of the graph on the right side there, that you compare the growth of the last couple of decades, pushing 25 years now, you can see that it is about a third of the rate of growth that we saw during the 1980s. You look at the left side of the graph, you see how VHFA assessed it in their needs assessment. What they're showing on the right side of the graph is that we need year in, year out production levels that are far in excess of the current creeping higher levels of housing production, which is what you see in the blue. So we certainly think we're meeting. You guys are making this decision at a moment where while we can't be content with the modest progress that has been made in recent years, that we are well below where we have been historically, and that there are negative impacts flowing from that, and that we need dramatic change. Here's a couple more graphs. I want to thank the Vermont. Okay, yeah.
I just want to comment on the best time to plant a tree is now. And I realize that the focus of this is housing, but the thing that we're not really paying attention is that municipal side, where we have infrastructure that is getting older and older by the day, that municipalities don't have the funds to correct the infrastructure needs. And by building housing or, using the TIF to do infrastructure, it creates a grand list value that can be tapped into for fixing that infrastructure. Just wanted to throw that out there.
100% agree, of course. And I think it is. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. I guess I just want to share these graphs that I think I've only seen for the first time recently from the Vermont Futures Project. This shows, it takes a little moment to sort of see what's going on here. But on the left side is the age distribution in Vermont at the turn of the century, before the kind of underbuilding that we've seen the last 25 years. And what you see there is that you had a kind of 25 to 49 population of 226,000. That's people in the kind of prime working years, generating revenues. And you saw the 65 plus population was 77,000. After this underbuilding period, you see a real shift in both those areas. The 225 has dropped to 194 for the 25 to 49 population, and the 65 plus population has essentially close to doubled. This population graph, I think is really interesting as well, in that it shows that historically, going back to the 60s, we have been a state that, once the highways went in, once we made some other, we had a period in Vermont's history where there was basically no population growth from the 1850s to the 1950s, but that changed in 1960. We saw steady growth in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and it's really the last 20 years which has been out of the norm, where we've more or less flattened off. And if we get back, what the kind of right-hand side of the graph shows is if we kind of make up for lost time here, by finding a way to build at a higher rate, we would just be sort of getting back to that trajectory we were currently on. And that, from Let's Build Homes perspective, that's really what we're trying to do here, is change the trajectory, because of the troubling things that the current trajectory, the trajectory of the last 25 years has put us on. And, I guess as you, I think those were fair points made at the end of the presentation about what you could do to limit this tool or to put a but-for test on. We'd encourage you to not lose sight of these big picture trends and the what we need to do to get back, from our perspective, to a healthy place.
Yeah, can you go back one slide?
Yes.
Slide. So, I mean, what you see here is, 23 years, and you see that group of 35 to 49-year-olds just move up those years, and then a significant decrease in our birth rates. And so we're talking about the next slide where we're saying that we're going to go up. That has to be influx from other states, right?
Or people that we're losing here that, I think, part of what's going on from 2000 to, so of course, lots of things, complicated things going on at the same time, but certainly it's the case that there were, 18 to 25-year-olds back in 2000 that wanted to stay here in Vermont and were unable to do so because of limited economic opportunity, limited housing opportunity, had to move away, are no longer here with us so, I think that, yes, part of, and to this rising population certainly will include some new people coming in, but it would also include people who want to stay here being able to stay.
I mean,
We're being forced out currently.
right? Because if you go back again, the average age of, granted our lifespans are going up, but we're looking at the ages where people are going to start decreasing that larger amount.
Right. But I just want to stress, I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which people are currently, with the current scarcity, being forced out of the system. We saw it in Burlington, when we went through, a period of virtually no new units being built in downtown Burlington. Over a 12-year period, we lost the percentage of people who were living in the downtown that were young professionals dropped precipitously. They were forced out by the people who could afford the rising rents were older, wealthier, more established folks. So I really think part of it, if we get the housing production right, you will be allowing people who grew up here to stay here in greater numbers. You will be allowing people who go to school at UVM, more of them to stay. You will be allowing people who leave for some time to more easily return, like I did. I left in my 20s. I came back when I was 30. I think that's a lot harder to do for a lot of people today. Last thing I want to kind of proactively say, and then answer any questions you have, is I do just want to speak to the prior testimony raised this question of the but-for test, and that's something certainly the state auditor raised when we were over on the Senate side. So far, the Senate did not choose to put a but-for test in here. And to me, there that is the right decision for at least four reasons. One, I guess one I've already talked about. We're trying to really move the lever here and bend the curve. Secondly, I don't think we should be content or optimistic that the modest increases we've seen in the recent years are necessarily going to continue. This moment when we finally have some consensus, we need to build new homes, has arrived at exactly the same time that historically high interest rates have returned and when construction costs have really ballooned. This is a hard time for new projects to get started. And I don't think even, the examples that were given of projects that didn't need this kind of assistance a few years ago, that may well not be the case now because the conditions have worsened. So at a time when we're trying, I think there's consensus we want to be increasing, that things have gotten hard. This would be a force working against that by it wouldn't cover all of it doesn't do anything about interest rates. It doesn't do anything about the general sort of rising construction costs. It does do something about these public infrastructure costs, which right now are additional costs put on most projects. And so a second point as to why not to add the but-for test is and I think I really appreciate the conversation you had. It is very hard for you write this but-for test into black and white in the statute, and it makes it look like it's this very straightforward analysis. The reality is it is very hard to determine. It is a judgment call, as you said, Representative Olson, and it is a very different thing difficult thing for regulators to determine. I think it is appropriate in certain situations when there is a real downside. There are certain questions when you want to make sure you're not spending a dollar more than you have to get something to move forward. I don't think that's the situation we face. First of all, the downsides of not doing enough are large, as I hope these graphs have pointed out. We have not been doing enough for decades, and we're suffering the effects of that now. That is a real risk of having too difficult a but-for threshold to move forward. On the other side, what is the downside of if you're modestly too generous here, given the way in which the money can be used, it is even thinking of it as, the term that is used is foregone revenue. And it is true that there is some foregone revenue from the Ed Fund. It is not foregone revenue from other public values, though, other public goods that you're trying to create. It is creating more municipal infrastructure. It is potentially lowering the cost of the housing that gets built because this cost is no longer being put on the project. So this is not a situation where if you spend slightly too much, you've just sort of cut a bad deal. And I think this is really fundamentally why it's appropriate not to have a but-for test. Is this money is going into other important public assets, important public goals. Finally, and this is related to earlier points, but I think there's a growing consensus in this country and in the state that one of the problems government has been having and that has put us in this kind of national mess that we're in is government hasn't been delivering results fast enough. We have not had enough priority on results. We have not had high enough priority on speed. And getting too focused on but-for tests or other ways in which you could dial this thing back, I think risks slowing down these new homes getting built and slowing down these results that I think we have some consensus to try to achieve. So I think the bill has changed. I meant to say at the top, the bill has changed a fair amount since I last testified to you. And if you want to get into questions about those changes and Let's Build, we haven't driven all those changes as Let's Build Homes. We're happy to speak to them. We think it's generally moved in a direction we're very satisfied with. I think one smart thing that was done, and I will speak to, is instead of this but-for test or some kind of affordability test being put in on the Senate side, what they did is they put this sunset in and said, let's see what this does, and let's take a hard look in a few years and see, what kind of housing is getting built with this, what kind of impact on prices this seems to have had. And to me, that's given the magnitude of the crisis we face, given the magnitude of pain we have from the housing shortage out here, I think that's a really appropriate way to handle it here. Maybe in 5 years, it will make sense to dial some aspect of this back. But let's err on the side of getting things done. Let's err on the side of getting homes built, and let's err on the side of getting them built as quick as we can. That's really what I had to say. I'm happy to answer any questions more questions, guys.
Questions for Merle?
So, one of the problems that Barry has is obviously flood issues. What's your thoughts on using this project to help lift?
Raise them.
Yeah.
So, my understanding of the way this bill works, and I think the lawyers have confirmed it, and I will say you're going to get a great technician coming up after me here who can back me up on some of these details and speak to them in greater granularity. This language has been crafted to include flood resilience expenses. Those are qualified expenses. I certainly think my understanding is that costs that to do some kind of raising or relocation would absolutely be qualified costs. And I think it could be a powerful tool for managing that kind of transition that a number of our communities need to make. And to your point, I think this is a point you're making, but it's a great point. So let me just reinforce it. It's a way to make those investments without this building having to write a big check, without the municipalities having to write a big check. It's only new. I mean, you don't really get this increment unless there's some kind of improvement and expansion going on. If it's just one house that is not really increasing or if it's one building that's not really increasing its value by the raising, I guess it will be limited in how much value it creates. But if it's part of a broader effort that's adding development and value, the project does pay for that, but it pays for it out of these public revenues instead of that being an additional. I think, we had some debate over on the Senate side on this. Let me just say it here is like there was some discussion of calling what CHIP does a subsidy for the project. And I actually don't think that is a fair characterization. It is, well, I think the better characterization is that the status quo is that if there is some kind of public infrastructure need that is necessary for a project, that the way we pay for that in most cases is through an additional tax on that project and on the people living in that project. And even though that, for most of what we're allowing here, we're talking about public infrastructure that the municipality and the state, in a sense, is going to own and is going to receive revenues and benefits for a long period of time. I think really from a tax fairness perspective, putting that as an additional tax on that group of people is questionable. This is getting rid of that tax, allowing the project still to pay for it, but through the focusing of the future revenues from that project. It doesn't impact the other taxpayers. It doesn't impact this building. Doesn't impact the municipal budgets.
If you can keep somebody at home.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a question, but I also wanted to know the change from when you made your presentation. I think it was 2 months ago, a month and a half anyway.
It's been a little while.
And one of the changes that I thought was very, very helpful was to expand the location criteria to get beyond just the 1A and 1B to tier 2.
Well, you know, we always have the existing settlement, so, but this does, you're right, this is a substantial increase in the.
I think it'd be very, very helpful for some of these smaller towns who are really flatlining in terms of housing construction. I wonder, some of these very small towns, obviously they need to have the motivation to enter this process. But again, it's pretty small, limited staff, available. I'm wondering if you see any role for some entity, whether it's on a regional level or a state level, to do things like, developing a draft, templates, for how you do some of these things like the agreements or whatever. Maybe that's not a good example, but if you see any role for folks to be able to help some of these smaller municipalities, really give them a nudge as much as anything, in terms of, yeah, you can do this kind of thing.
Yeah, couple things on that, Representative Olson. I think great. I'm glad you're focusing on this. One, as I understand, and please grill David on it too, the way in which the legislation is written, it is an allowable cost for a municipality to use some of these CHIP revenues for paying for the RDCs or the RPCs to provide technical assistance or really administrative assistance to help do the work necessary to create these infrastructure agreements and then administer them. And so that is allowable, and I think an important aspect of this. The other point I want to make just here, I think, is your question about like motivation. You're 100% right that none of these happen. The gateway to any of this happening is the municipality needs to be willing to negotiate and approve at the legislative body a infrastructure agreement with the project for this to go forward. If the municipality doesn't want it to happen, it doesn't happen. This bill, I think, has the potential to restore that municipal motivation that in many ways has been lost over the last 40 years because of the way that the statewide property tax has worked, and that the state, at least in Burlington, is taking a greater and greater and greater share, more or less, with each ensuing year. I mean, it's gotten to the point, my understanding is that most municipalities, the property tax bill, somewhere between 70 and 80% of the revenues collected for that property taxes goes to the ed fund. And I think what that has done, this is a little bit speculation on my part, if you'll allow it, but I think it's good for us all to be grappling with. There used to be kind of a historic, a lot of the reason for having municipalities and having cities and towns and villages was work with property owners to see investment and to have grand list growth and to have new things built. The statewide property tax has, I think, severed some of that relationship. This CHIP bill, where municipalities who pursue this, and not just the big municipalities, I think this is going to be a tool that can be used by any municipality in the state. It will, I think, restore some of those old muscles and could be very good for local governments. They may end up doing more of this. They may not need it all to be done by the RPCs and RDCs. I think, there's a lot of capacity at even, some of these smaller places. But if they need that capacity, they can sub it out and they will have resources to do that.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you a second time. And if there is follow-up, please send questions our way. We're happy to follow up. Thanks.
So I'm not quite sure how I go about connecting my screen to, no, bro, was just, you send it to me, I will click on it and join in. fat fingers and don't work well with these, whatever these are on the touchpads. Thank you. So I like to have a mouse. Okay, let me connect in. Got to get the email first. There it is. Screen share. Connecting. Great. I don't want computer audio, do I? Okay. I do not want to do that, so I'm going to do that. Yes, I want to join. Continue. Okay, great. And now I need to share and select. Okay. And go to view and full screen mode. Got it. Okay. Thank you all for having me here again. For the record, I am David White. I'm president of White and Burke Real Estate Advisors. Although I'm here purely as a volunteer, I haven't been engaged by any client to do this work, and I don't represent Let's Build Homes. Let's Build Homes, I'm really representing myself, although I've come with a great deal of background and experience, and we're certainly coordinating with Let's Build Homes. I want to speak to a couple of things, and I've got a presentation prepared, but having heard some of the prior testimony, I would like to start by just sharing a couple of stories. I'm involved right now, my company is involved right now with 2 workforce housing projects in the state, one of them in St. Albans and one of them in Rockingham Bellows Falls. And around this question of but for, I'm 100% with what Moreau had to say. The reality is we are not building enough housing, and that's the urgent need here at this point. And to illustrate how challenging that is, let me tell the story of St. Albans right now. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but there's this property on the edge of downtown called the Fonda site that was an industrial site. The city actually purchased 15 years ago and spent $6 million getting various grants and various funding sources, and TIF as a piece of it, because it is in the city's TIF district, to do the brownfield cleanup. There were PCBs and all kinds of other issues there. Cleaned it up, got it ready, and through, again, a bit of TIF and some grant funding sources and so forth and so on, built a new entry drive, brought all new utilities to the site, and had it completely development ready. Plus, the city manager, Dominic Cloud, and I went out and obtained through the treasurer's 10% for Vermont program and through the rental revolving loan fund that is administered by Vermont Housing Finance Agency, we put together a combined $9.8 million, which we expect to be about 40 to 45% of the total cost of what will be an 87-unit multifamily workforce housing project. So we packaged all of this together, and I personally managed an RFP process to go out to the development community to attract developers. And we're willing to sell this property for $1 to a developer. So $1, 40 to 45% of their financing already lined up at low interest rates. We got 3 proposals. I went to a lot of developers who are both contractors and developers. I had 2 in particular, both of whom have done a huge amount of multifamily, who looked at me and said, David, I can't make the numbers work. You're talking about free land, 9.8 million, 45% of their financing is subordinate low interest debt. They couldn't make the numbers work. Of the 3 we got, one of them from various reasons we didn't want, it wasn't an acceptable proposal. One of them was an out-of-state firm who said, well, we really want to do the project, but we can't make the numbers work. And if you'll work with us to get more financing, we'd like to do it, which left us with 1 proposal. And we are largely done with the permit process. I expect the permits to be issued any day, and I'm hopeful that all the tariffs and so forth aren't going to utterly kill this project. But think about that for a moment, how staggeringly difficult. And we went out to absolutely everybody I know, and I believe me, I've been at this business for a long time. So I know a lot of folks. Tell you about Bellows Falls, similar, not quite as dramatic, but right in the heart of downtown, right on the river, a great site, municipally owned, a current municipal parking lot, views of the river, views of downtown, walking distance to absolutely everything. The city's willing to sell it. The town is willing to sell it for $1 to a developer. I didn't personally, one of my staff members went out, managed the RFP process, 0 proposals, not one. Nobody could figure out how to make the numbers work. We have finally entered into an agreement with a contractor / developer who said, look, I want to have a year of exclusive rights due diligence. We will spend the time seeing if we can figure out how to put this together. And what they're tentatively looking at is bringing in an affordable housing developer. We wanted to install to be workforce housing, but bring in an affordable housing developer because they can bring some subsidy to help finance part of it, but also do a buy and abutting piece and do a commercial project on it so they can bring in new market tax credits to package it all together. Think about that for a moment. How it's just incredibly, incredibly difficult to put these projects together. And when I think about Williston, which I'm very familiar with, I live in Burlington, and Williston, the town of Williston is actually a client of my company's. A lot of the projects that are going on today are being built on sites where the infrastructure was installed in years past. And so they don't have the kinds of challenges on those sites, Cottonwood Crossing being one of those. But there are other sites that don't have the infrastructure where the town's trying to figure out how do we make this work because the numbers don't work anymore. It's just a very, very different environment than it was 5-10 years ago. And it's simply the economic reality of how these things happen. So at any rate, sorry, I just had to throw that in, even though it wasn't part of my prepared presentation, because I think those stories illustrate how very, very difficult this is today. Please.
I'm just curious. I mean, that's pretty staggering information there. Was there any indication as to why the numbers wouldn't work? I guess what I'm looking for, are we dealing with state policy or is it just something that they would deal with nationwide?
I don't know about nationwide, but it is, it's a very good question. It really is the basic fundamental costs of construction today have escalated so dramatically since before the pandemic, up 30-40%. That the rental rates, in Vermont, we are caught in this unusual and painful spot where rents are too high for people to afford and yet not high enough to pay for the cost of construction. And so we're trapped in this kind of no man's land where the numbers don't work for anybody. They don't work for the tenants. They don't work for the developers. And so we are pretty badly stuck. And so that's really the fundamental issue here. It's the construction costs that have escalated so dramatically. The long term, I would hope that as part of, as we economic development in the state as a whole, that we would see our income levels, average income levels rise faster than the cost of rents, and we gradually close that gap. That's a wish for a dream. Whether we can pull it off, I don't know. And there's no one easy solution for that. By way of just reminder, this is where I was going to start. I've been involved in community development, economic development in Vermont for 45 years. My career did start here in downtown Montpelier in 1980. So I've been at this a long, long time. Most of my work is at the present time working for municipalities and for nonprofit institutions like the UVM Medical Center and various colleges and so forth around the state. I won't bore you with the rest of it because you heard it previously, but I just want to do that quick reminder. Let me go through my presentation here. So one of the key things, and we did talk about this before, but I think it's worth emphasizing about the CHIP proposal, is that we're really focused on a single site. Now, it may be made of multiple properties. There may be 3 different properties that you're combining, but it's a project on a site. And the project may be phased. I think in many cases, it'll be a single building on a single parcel. But it's conceivable that there would be 2 or 3 or more buildings where, over a period of several years as the market absorbs them. But it's still a project. It's not a district. And what that means for a municipality, and part of the key focus here, is that it reduces the complexity dramatically because of big TIFs. And as you may recall, my company's been involved in all but one of the TIFs in the state of Vermont, most of which we set up, some of which we're just consultants on, but very familiar with the way TIF works and the strengths of it and some of the challenges. And, one of the challenges is that you've got to keep track of all these properties in the entire TIF district and what their values are and how they're changing. you also need to be constantly looking for new opportunities for new projects. And the TIF districts that have been really successful, whether it's in Burlington or St. Albans, Hartford come to mind, are ones that have proactively gone out, really used it as a tool, looking for development. Smaller communities probably don't have the capacity to do that. They probably don't have the market demand, and they probably don't have the staffing and professional capacity to do that. So this is designed very much to say that's not the expectation here. It's a project. If you have another opportunity for another project a couple years later, great, you can set up another one. But it's a project without the baggage, if you will, of having to track all these other properties and having to constantly try to look for additional projects to do. So there's not that kind of ongoing effort. But it also means that you're not picking up so-called background growth. One of the criticisms of Big TIF, and I won't get into, my arguments about why I don't agree with it, but anyway, is that there's this background growth. And that you're picking up on, other properties that you haven't directly incentivized through your infrastructure. And this goes away because there are no other properties. It is, your site, your development. You're not dealing with the question of background growth. So keeping it simple and keeping it usable. So part of the idea here is that we're trying to keep the criteria as simple as possible and as few as possible. We would like to hope that the rules will be written. In fact, I've been tempted to suggest that an amendment would be in that one section that was John Gray talked about earlier about the rulemaking. Rulemaking, and keep it as simple as possible if you want to give them instructions and put some parameters around it, so that it's easier to use for towns. And yes, towns may use outside resources. It's absolutely designed to allow that to bring in. And I think the RDCs and the RPCs are the perfect place. Vermont League of Cities and Towns has a technical support program, could help. If they want to, they can come to a consulting firm like mine, but that's not, believe me, I'm at an age where I'm trying to slow down, not speed up. So I'm not trying to gain more business for myself here. So trying to keep that as simple. One of the other ways that it could be simple is this is the option for the developer to actually be responsible for constructing the infrastructure. And that's regardless of who the entity is that's building it. In Burlington, for example, with the City Place project, we've got a massive development going on, a very sophisticated development team, and the very sophisticated city. The developer is building the infrastructure, and the city is reimbursing them for the cost of it. But the developer is responsible for it, so that the developer, it serves the developer and the city staff doesn't have to go through that management process. But it also means the developer, if there's a lack of coordination in terms of timing when something's done, that's all on the developer. They can't go and point fingers at the city. So in any event, a small town could say, as part of the development agreement that this calls for, the infrastructure agreement, to say, okay, part of the agreement is you, developer, are responsible for building this, not us. You're going to manage that process. You need to make sure you go out to bid, that you get, competitive pricing and all that kind of stuff, but you're responsible for it. We don't have the capacity to manage it. We don't have that kind of staff on staff to do that work. And there is, as you know, the option for the developer or a third-party agency to finance it. And the administration here on an ongoing basis, dramatically different than Big TIF. Big TIF, where again, you're having to manage and monitor all these different parcels and properties and their values. Here, you're talking about one property, one project. It may be several properties that are put together, but it's one project. And and so all they're doing is having to track the money off of that one project and the costs for that one project. So there's not the kind of complexity that's gotten some municipalities, including Burlington, in some trouble about tracking all that stuff. And again, there's not the ongoing development effort. So small projects, I may have shown this to you before, but I think it's worth looking at. I did quickly ran the numbers. If you're in a small town and somebody proposes 4 units, and you're adding only $200,000 of assessed value each, and it's likely to be significantly more than that in today's market, but I was trying to be conservative, and you assume a tax rate of just a hair under $3 combined between municipal and education at 80%. I didn't bother to split it 80, 100. That will finance about $240,000 worth of infrastructure over a 20-year bond. And so you think about that could pay for a community septic system, or drilling the well, or bringing in the water pipe if there's municipal water from, a quarter mile down the road, or whatever it is. So these don't have to be large projects for it to make sense to do these deals. Okay, one of the concerns is, yes,
Could broadband be considered infrastructure?
yes, that is part of the definition, is, keep in mind, so it says digital infrastructure is one of the terms that's in there, and I will talk a little bit more about infrastructure, what's allowed in just a moment. I've got some thoughts on that, but that's absolutely already in the draft. But keep in mind that the infrastructure that's built has to be necessary for that project. Now, it can also benefit other projects if you're, putting in a quarter mile of water pipe to get to the site for a project. Others certainly could connect in along the way. But you can't say arbitrarily, well, we want to do digital infrastructure, for example, that's going to the other end of town, paying for off of this project. You could pay for that stretch that comes to this project. And others along the way could connect in.
But you would have to design the district to include that stretch, correct?
No, the infrastructure can be outside of the development site. It doesn't have to be on the site, but it has to be necessary to serve, it has to serve that site. So that it could be, again, you've got a development site that, is here, and the water or the digital infrastructure ends here, and you're paying to get it there because it's going to serve that site. Yes, please.
If there's a capacity issue, it ends here and you need it over here.
Yeah.
But there's capacity issues that include it wouldn't be sufficient to handle the new load as well. Then you go all the way back to the source of
You
the
can.
project.
You can, within the financial constraints,
Right.
right?
Right.
It depends on the size of the project and how much increment it's generating and how much that will finance. But yes. And I will also say that, most of the projects, in fact, virtually every project, a TIF project I've been involved with, and there've been a lot of them, TIF alone has not paid for the cost of the infrastructure. The municipality has typically gone out and gotten grants, whether it's Northern Borders grants or brownfield grants or what have you, to bring in, or community development block grants to help with maybe the sidewalks or whatever. Usually there's a layering of the capital stack of the various pieces to get all the funding you need to do everything. So, for example, in the water, you could go to, I always forget about the SRF, is that what it's called? The revolving loan fund for water, that it's a very low interest that the state has. Maybe you get a piece off of that, and maybe that loan is not paid for from this, but it's paid for out of user fees. Each one of these, and one of the reasons why there's not going to be a single template. You were asking about templates. There's not going to be a simple template or a single template for the way these are put together, because each deal is unique, and you need to figure out exactly, what will that generate in the way of increment. What can it support? What the specific piece of infrastructure does it need? What other resources are being brought to bear? And you have to negotiate an agreement that makes sense for that circumstance. So it's going to vary. Every deal I've worked on, and I've worked on a lot of these, it has been different. We've had to negotiate a unique agreement. One of the keys of the infrastructure agreement, though, is to build in the protections for the municipality. What you don't want is the municipality to incur debt, and then, the project doesn't happen, and they've already borrowed the money and spent the money, and you're sitting there, right? So how do you do that? And a key piece of that is the infrastructure agreement, where it's actually a binding contract between the municipality and the developer. And if there's a separate third-party financer, it also would involve that entity. And it'll spell out what those protections are. And again, each one will be unique. There's not one standard one, but one of the common ways that we have done it, but sometimes it doesn't work for various reasons, is to require to state that the municipality will not commence its construction until and unless the developer closes on its financing for its project. So the project is actually going to move forward. That's one way you can do it. There are others. There are times when that doesn't work because your infrastructure is not going to be completed in time for the development. You need to start earlier, and then maybe you build in the developer providing some guarantee for any gap in financing. Again, each situation is unique. It does require negotiating it, but you build those protections in. And again, one of the benefits of the concept of the developer doing the financing rather than municipality is that then the municipality is simply a conduit. It's not a general obligation bond. Typical TIF bonds or GO bonds, and the voters have to approve it, and the voters are ultimately on the hook in the event something falls apart. If the developer does the borrowing, that goes away. It's on the developer. The municipality is simply a conduit for the funds to flow. The developer pays the taxes, and the municipality pays back to the developer that portion that's needed to retire that piece of the debt that relates to the infrastructure they've agreed to pay for. Okay, we're going to move on. So one of the questions that's come up, and it does relate to some things you've heard before that I want to focus on, because I think it's an important point. It's one of the last points that Ted made, is the ability ultimately for there to be revenues beyond what are needed to pay the debt in some circumstances. And I want to talk about that a little bit. And it's built in already in the section that John talked about. It's section 1910C(d)(2). Basically, it says that any excess incremental revenues beyond those that are needed get distributed to the municipality and the education fund proportional to how they came in. And it doesn't require the piece that Ted talked about. It could be required. I wouldn't oppose that. But what I have envisioned from day one when I first developed this whole concept for CHIP is that if you think about it, this is a significant difference from general TIF districts. In so-called big TIF districts, the incentive for a municipality is to hold on to all the increment because you're wanting to do future projects. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's everything right about that. But the incentive is there to hold on to it so that you've got a pool of money that helps you finance the next project that you want to do in your TIF district during the debt window, that 10-year debt incurrence window. In the case of this, because the project is discrete, you don't have that incentive anymore. Once all the debt has been issued, and it may be issued over a few tranches, you may have a project that's phased where you're building, this amount of infrastructure this year, 2 years later, after that building's complete, if there's another building or whatever, you're building another piece and then another piece. But once you've issued the full debt, you'll know what the debt service is, you'll know how much money you need, and at that point, there's every incentive for both the education fund and the municipality to take every excess back. And I would simply say that the way I envision it is that it would not be reducing percentage per se, but rather probably fixing a dollar amount. Because over time, I think we all know taxes tend to increase, not go up. Tax rates tend to increase. And so even if no more development happens, you're going to start to generate over coming years increased revenues. And once you know that let's say you need, $500,000 a year in, I'm sorry, let me take that back. That's too big a number. Let's say it's $50,000 a year in tax revenue off of that project, and that's all you need to pay all your debt. You can simply reach the point where that's fixed, and all the rest starts to go out to the ed fund, starting as soon as you know your debt service. That can happen, if there's excess. I will just parenthetically say that one of the challenges in TIF districts that will also be true here is that there's typically a window at the very beginning where the revenues haven't kicked in yet because the project hasn't hit the grand list yet, but you do have debt service. This does allow you to actually finance in some of the interest for the first few years, which is nice and beneficial, and I absolutely support that. I wrote it into the original concept. The downside is it's to the extent you're financing interest, there's less money available for infrastructure because it's still constrained by how much increment you're projecting and how much it can support in the way of debt. So the reason why I'm raising it now is that there may be a few years where there's negative cash flow, where there's not enough money. and where it takes a few years to catch up. But after that, at any rate, I'm getting in the weeds more than I need to. The point is there's an opportunity here earlier than regular TIF districts to start to distribute more money to both the municipality and the education fund.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
So, in the bill now, like at that point in the future, when there's excess revenue, who's making that decision about at what point to start sending it back?
The bill doesn't specify
Yeah,
that today.
So-
It doesn't. And, I'm not sure it needs to be specified. You certainly could specify it. You could require that once all debt service is known, you must go back to VEPSI. I wouldn't object to that. And then have that discussion around it and, get VEPSI to agree on whatever is going to happen. You could write that in and I wouldn't object to that. That said, I'm not sure it's necessary because again, the municipality has the same incentive.
Right.
They want to get those excess revenues too. It's not doing them any good to just sit in an account. Along with the ed fund money. Nobody's served by that. So I don't think it's necessary, but if you want to put it in, I wouldn't object to that change.
I know it's already.
Okay, let me move on. So I want to talk about now the question of growth and supplement the work that JFO does. And I want to be very clear, I respect JFO enormously, and I think Ted's done a great job on his analysis. But I want to talk about growth. I've done an analysis of 2 different municipalities, and we'll get to those in just a moment, but I want to draw a real distinction, and Ted talked about this a little bit today, but I want to focus on it. When you look at grand list growth, there are really 2 key components. One of them is just inflation and value. Your own home goes up in value. You didn't necessarily spend any money on it. You didn't improve it, but it's still, the market's going to likely drive it up in value unless you let it deteriorate, which some people do, but it's going to go up in value. But then there's investment that creates new value. You build an addition on your home, that creates new value. Somebody builds a brand new building, that creates new value. And so when you look at grand list growth, I think it's important to keep in mind those 2 different things. And what the purpose of both TIF and CHIP is to stimulate investment and to try to get people to build things and to do this. And so I've done a detailed analysis looking at 2 different TIF districts, both of which I've worked on and very intimately familiar with. So it made it somewhat easier, although it's still very time consuming to do this work. St. Albans and Hartford to say, okay, what happened? And the methodology I used is that if you think about it for just a moment, between there's a townwide reappraisal between 1 year and then X number of years later, there's a second one. You're not the grand list, the ostensible grand list in that community, any change in it only reflects investment if it's gone up or loss of value if a building burned or something if it goes down. It is because you have not reassessed it to capture the inflation and value. Now the inflation value has occurred, but the grand list data that you have doesn't capture that inflation. So what I've done is to look at the period of time before a TIF district was set up in Hartford and in St. Albans between their prior reappraisals, and what was the rate of growth in those 2 communities, and then what happened afterwards in those 2 communities once between reappraisals. And I want to show you that data because it is absolutely fascinating, and even I was surprised by it. And I will show you the data in just a moment, but what I'm looking at here, as I said, is grand list growth from investment only. I'm not looking at inflation. That's what I was trying to parse out. And so I looked at grand list growth in the municipality as a whole, and I had to do that because we didn't have data for a TIF district because it didn't exist before. So I'd look at the municipality as a whole in each case, then look at what happened in the TIF district and look at what portion that TIF district is of the change afterwards in the municipality as a whole. And one of the things I found, and I'll show you the data in just a moment, is that it actually arguably increased, didn't decrease, the payments to the education fund compared to what would have happened had the prior trends occurred. So let's look at Hartford here. They did, and if you'll bear with me, I think I'll actually stand up for this. So they did a reappraisal in 2008. They did another one in 2018, so a 10-year period. Now it happens in the middle of that, in 2012, they set up a TIF district, but they didn't do anything with it. It took 3 or 4 years for them to actually get their first project lined up. So their first TIF debt was in 2015. So that's when it starts to, you look at when the impact of TIF starts to be felt. So what happened here is that if you look at the grand list, and that's what this blue line is, that between 2008 and 2015, they had a couple of years of growth, and then their grand list actually declined. And unfortunately, they've had enough staff turnover that the institutional memory is gone. I don't have the details of why, but in trying to read their annual reports, it appears that a lot of people were busy appealing their assessments, and some properties were purchased and became non-taxable. And I'm not quite clear, but their grand list value went down an average over that period of time, over 7 years. And that includes the increase and then the decrease. So during that period of time, by an average of 0.7% per year. Then starting in 2015, you start to see the impact of TIF, and the reappraisal was a few years later, and there's actually a decrease then too. Their property values went down in Hartford. Not a huge amount, but it did. So I went ahead and left that in. If you look at that period of time, including that decrease, and over here, over the 9 years from 2016 to 2025, it actually went up by almost 0.9% or 8.86. So a flip of over 1% from negative to positive. Now, I will admit, we don't know what would have happened if there wasn't a TIF district. But all I can say is this is the fact of what happened in their grand list. So in the TIF district itself, their original taxable value was $33 million and change. Since then, they've added slightly more. They have literally doubled the value inside the TIF district during that period of time. And this looks at the education fund. Now, again, I admit, I don't know what would have happened had there not been TIF. All I can do is say, if you follow the prior trend of that gradually decreasing, the ed fund actually would have had decreasing amount of money coming into it. What actually happened, if you look at that period of time, is over 10 years, more than $2 million more, even though it's only, and this is a TIF district where 75% is retained, 25%. So the older TIF districts, 25% goes to the ed fund rather than 30 under newer ones. So that 25% actual payments of almost $2.1 million more than would have been had it followed the prior trend. Again, I have no way of knowing what the prior trend would have been. And so this is not a decrease in revenue to the ed fund at all. Let me tell you about in St. Albans. So St. Albans is a different picture. In St. Albans, they had a 2004 reappraisal. The next one's 2012. And it happens that the TIF district became active in 2013. So the timing works out really well here. During that period of time, 2004 to 2012, there was growth going on, not much, 0.4% average annual increase. All of this that you see is entirely the increase in the assessment. This is not growth. This is just appraised value because of inflation. You then start to look at what happened with the TIF district. And since that time, the growth has been an average of 1.26% per year. So more than triple what the growth rate was. And this is citywide, with 80% of that growth in the TIF district. And we have underway right now $20 million worth of development, 3 projects, which are also in the TIF district, which have all been incentivized by TIF. So that number is going to go up dramatically next year. We'll all hit the grand list, or they'll start paying as of July 1st this year. 2 of those are almost completed construction. So these are not just dreams. The third one's the one I talked about earlier that I hope will actually happen. They're about done with the permitting, and we hope to be under construction in June. I still do expect it, but have a little bit of fear in my gut around that one. But that's going to make those numbers even more dramatic. So then you look at the TIF district itself, whereas they doubled in the value of the TIF district in Hartford, in St. Albans, it went up by 47%. I think it's still a pretty big number. From 123 million, they added another 58 million to the TIF district. And then you look at the Ed Fund. And if it had followed that prior trend, again, I don't know what would have happened, but for TIF, in fiscal year 24, the Ed Fund at that point would be receiving 107,405 from if it had received 100% of increased value during that period of time. Again, over the original taxable value, and I use the same methodology for both. Whereas what it actually got last year was 289,000, called 290,000, almost 3 times as much actually went into the Ed Fund. And cumulatively over the 11 years so far of the TIF district, it adds up to over $1.5 million more than had it followed the prior trend. That's straight off of their grand list data, all of that. So that's all by way of saying that TIF works. If what you're trying to measure is it incentivizing development that wasn't otherwise occurring? And that's different than the question of, capturing inflation and value and so forth. I mean, they're two different things. So I'm not disagreeing with JFO. I'm just trying to point out the purpose here is incentivizing growth, and it's worked. Those are in those two communities.
One of the things that development does is it sparks additional development. I know that
Yes.
in Berry City, we did the Berry City Place.
Yes.
And one of the developers that had applied to be the developer for that ended up doing the Blanchard block as well,
Yeah,
bringing a massive amount of tax revenue into the city.
exactly. Exactly. That's part of the reason why background growth, I object to some of the objections to background growth as an issue. Okay, so I do have some suggestions about amendments to this bill. It's not perfect, and I do have some suggestions about ways to amend it. And I will parenthetically say that, as Moreau referenced earlier, there were some changes made at the Senate level that are fine as far as he's concerned, I'm concerned. But we were fine with the way it was before too. And, one of those, by way of example, is that the inclusion of the tier 2 areas that we did not originally include. We were trying to, be restrictive, but what we heard from a lot of smaller municipalities, hey, wait a minute, what about us? And, 1A, 1B and all that maybe isn't enough. And so the Senate chose to put it in, and I understand why, and I support it. The tier 2 as well, to help the smaller communities. So there are various things like that that are not quite the way we originally proposed it, but the Senate made certain choices on, and I'm not going to talk about those here, but I do have a few suggestions. So one of them is that I did talk with there aren't that many attorneys in the state who act as bond counsel. There are just a handful. And I did talk with one with whom I've worked quite a bit. And he reviewed S-127. He said, David, as bond counsel, I'd be a lot more comfortable if it's implied that the increment can be pledged to the sponsor, if it's the developer or a third party, but it doesn't, nowhere says it explicitly. I'd be a lot more comfortable if you included explicit. I'll give you this information. You don't necessarily need to make notes on this. If feel free to do so, but so include an explicit statement. He actually drafted a paragraph that I provided to John Gray. You can ask John Gray to, if you agree with this, to incorporate it, or John's version of it. Secondly, is that the way we proposed it, and I still think this is the right way to do it, is right now, the way the Senate did it was to say, not more than 80% of the education fund and not less than 100% of the education increment, not less than 100% of municipal. I think that's a mistake. I think you want, particularly for some of the smaller towns, but for all communities, there'd be an opportunity for them to decide about that last 20%. And also there is a contradiction in the draft as it's currently written. Right now, it says in the related cost section that you can only pay for direct municipal costs, like the time that municipal staff spends on this. If you use a municipal increment only and only above the minimum allowed, well, or the minimum required. If the minimum required is 100%, there is no amount above. So my suggestion is that this get revised to say that the municipal level should not be any lower than whatever the education level is. You may not need 80%. Probably in most cases you will, but you may not. So it shouldn't be any less than whatever the education level is. But you're allowed to go up to 100% if that's what you choose to do. So that would be my recommendation. Thirdly, I do think that we should be more explicit than it currently is, that this is not just for new construction. I think it's implied certain places, but not as clear as it could be. That I think about in Barry, for example, you know, the provisions for flood remediation, we put in explicitly thinking about Barry as a community that could use it. And I think your point is important. And I think being clear that renovations to an existing residential structure are also eligible, and that could include. So I don't think it's a major deal, but tweak the language to make clear. And the other is that I know that John Gray has said that changing it from public purpose to public good means that you can finance private infrastructure as well as public. I read legislation all the time and statute all the time. I'm not an attorney, but I've done this for decades. That's not clear to me. If it's not clear to me, it's not going to be clear to other people. I think what's wrong with just simply saying infrastructure may be public or privately owned, and here are the things that are allowed. And if there's certain ones of those that you don't want to be allowed to be privately owned, then you pull out a separate. Infrastructure may include public or privately of this sort, and only public for this sort. That would be fine. But I would say public or privately owned, so that it's clear, particularly in some of these smaller communities where you may not have municipal water or sewer, that the private community septic system or the well is an eligible cost. And I just think it should be clearer. Okay. Related costs right now, and this was lifted right out of the TIF statute, simply say that municipal related costs. I think it should say sponsor related costs, because if a third-party sponsor or a developer is going to take on the financing, they're going to have certain costs, like the attorney's costs and the closing costs and whatever, that are also related costs. So it's just a tweak in the language to make it clear that related costs incurred by a sponsor are eligible. There are some other detail edits that I've already provided to John Gray that are just little wordsmithing things that I'm not going to bore you with. They're not policy related particularly. And I've already provided it to him. And I think I will get you a copy as well, and you can then consider those. But I don't think it's worth talking about today. I will say there's one other thing. Michael Gaughan of the Municipal Bond Bank, who I admire enormously, he is just one of the most brilliant finance minds in the state of Vermont, has this concept that he's originated that would be a special assessment wraparound on this whole thing that I think he's going to be coming forward with. I'm not going to talk to it today other than acknowledge I've discussed it with John.
Tomorrow morning.
Is he coming? Great. I expect if it's what I think it is, I expect that Moreau and I will both be supportive of it, but I'll leave it to him. I'm just giving you the heads up that I think that's coming. Okay. So some questions that have come up. One of them is, well, is this going to solve our problem? The answer is no. As I discussed with my examples of St. Albans and Rockingham Bellows Falls, our problem is bigger. This is a tool in the toolbox, and it may be very effective in some circumstances, not as enough in other circumstances, but it is a tool, and I think an enormously, potentially very valuable one. Another question that's come up is this financing, where the developer's allowed to do the financing and the money, the municipality is basically a conduit for it, is that used elsewhere? And the answer is yes. There are 32 states that allow that kind of financing in their TIF districts. So it is absolutely well established as a mechanism for a lot of the reasons that I talked about before, where it's actually, there's more risk on the developer, less on the municipality. There is, and you may not want to use it in every circumstance, one of the downsides is the interest rate's likely to be a little bit higher. There's a range of different considerations. There may be times when you want it to be municipal debt, but it is absolutely common in other states. The question of flood mitigation, I think we've addressed it, but yes, the intent from all along has been that could be private and public flood mitigation, including things like foundations that lift homes up, which will, by the way, create value. I don't know how much, it'll vary from instance to instance, but a home that's been flooded multiple times isn't going to be worth a heck of a lot.
Right. Well, I mean, especially if it qualifies for a FEMA buyout, it definitely doesn't qualify. I mean, I know for our tax assessments in Barry, we just tax for the property itself
Yes.
because
right.
the house is useless.
And whereas if you can raise it up, you then have a usable house, it now has greater taxable value.
And it stays on the tax rolls.
And then the questions come up whether TIF or CHIP is an expensive way to fund infrastructure because of all the interest costs. The answer is no, it's no different than a municipality issuing any kind of infrastructure bond. There's going to be interest costs there, and it's no more expensive than any other way you do that. But for tests we've talked about pretty endlessly, I'll tell you absolutely. I think there's an inherent but for we're simply not building enough housing. That's the priority here. That's my belief. And then I also mentioned already but I want to emphasize it, that the infrastructure here has to be something that serves the housing. It can't be just, one of the arguments people use in big TIF districts that I don't agree with, but you're replacing sidewalks on 3 blocks for one building. Come on. But that is actually helping the whole district be a more appealing place. This is a little bit different where it needs to be directly benefit that specific project, not general in the district. Background growth, we've already talked about it. No, there is no background growth because it's only one site. What about simply the governor's infrastructure revolving loan fund? Absolutely support it, no question. But it's relatively small dollars relative to the hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure needs in this state. And it competes with, as you well know, with other demands for limited amount of resources the state of Vermont has, whereas this is a self-funding mechanism. You're not competing against other uses. Okay.
Does anyone have more questions for David? Well, her.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Very, very helpful. There's maybe nitpicking a little bit, not
Please.
really, though. Page 32. Well, anyway, it's in the location criteria.
Yes.
And there's I'm looking at the tier, an area designated for tier 2, et cetera, et cetera. Or an area, or okay, maybe that's different. An area in which the housing development is compatible with regional land use plans as evidenced by the support from the regional planning. And I missed that or. So maybe that answers it, but I know that from going through the process with our local, our regional planning commission, they're engaged in the process right now of taking Act 181 and applying it to the region and then working with the town. So there's almost that process of ensuring not only compatibility, but
Yeah.
consistency
Yes.
is in process right now.
Yes. And that's why we put that, if I may, that's why we put it in that or section, because there is this interim period before the tiers are designated.
Oh, I see.
And so the idea is that until the tiers are designated, you go to the Regional Planning Commission and they can opine, is it consistent with the plan? And, which is similar to what they did for, I believe, the what was it, the program that VEPSI was administering out of the ARTA funds. I'm blanking on the name of the Vermont CRP, thank you. Where they asked the regional plan, is this consistent with the regional plan? What's the kind of location criteria for that?
I get it. I understand. Thanks.
Yep.
Questions?
Question. In the definition of infrastructure,
Yes.
is there anything we're missing in that definition that you think would be pertinent to add or would be helpful to add in there?
Sure. when I originally came up with this concept and started working with Moreau and others and crafting it, we made a political decision. And I want to be very clear, it's political to try to narrow things in terms of location, in terms of uses, in order to make it have the highest likelihood of getting through the legislature, to be perfectly honest. When the administration did their own interpretation, because I circulated my outline of this concept last year sometime, they built the Spark program around it. And with Spark, they included not just housing, but really other kinds of development. And they also said you could use the funds to directly invest in the housing project itself. I think there's value there, but I still politically make the judgment. You folks know the politics of the State House vastly better than I do. I'm a policy wonk, not a political wonk. There's value there that could be considered. There's also been discussion of much narrower ways. There are at least 3 policies that the state is pursuing that could be funded and you could choose to add in that we have chosen not to, but you could, if you think it's worthwhile and would fly. One of them is that you allow the funds to pay for green infrastructure, which could be, green roofs on buildings. That could be investing in, it already will pay for basic stormwater infrastructure that's outside the building, such as rain gardens. But there may be other kinds of investments there. It could also pay for investments for energy efficiency to, for instance, help the building be able to achieve the Vermont energy efficiency folks have this, I'm blanking on the name of it, but a high performance standard in their rules. And to help a building go from the basic standards to a high performance standard, what's that cost? And could you help finance that? It's a public benefit. That would be a direct investment in the building. And it could, for example, help pay for doing groundwater-based type system rather than purely electric system or what have you. So those are examples. The third one that I've heard suggested is that, when we have inclusionary housing where you required 15 or 20% of a building to be affordable, capital A, to people 80% of median or below, that's a cost shift between those units and the other units in the building that raises the cost of those units and thus the price to everybody else to pay for those. And so there's been some discussion, should you allow this mechanism to pay for that delta in cost that subsidizes those 20%? So those 3 approaches I like a lot, but they would be crossing a line from infrastructure to direct investment in the building, which I believe the administration supports, but various people in this building may not.
But still meets the definition of public good.
I think it would meet public good. Personally, I think all 3 of those are major policy goals here in the state of Vermont. And I would support those being in there. I fear that if you include them, that there'd be enough opposition. Does this whole concept get shunted off into a summer study committee and we lose a year or something, right? So there's a political decision there more than a policy decision, it seems to me, that you guys are better positioned to make than I am.
Mike?
Hi, David. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it. I guess my first question is, the language is extremely broad, that it just says that the project has to have a housing component. And I know we've been, some of the discussions have been, don't be too prescriptive of what that means. And so I'm wondering, I think the intent, and I think you showed it on the screen today, was that this is for housing, providing housing. And I'm just wondering, maybe some language that we would provide to VEPC on how they write their rules and how they oversee these contracts and things when they come out, the project criteria. would be right way to go instead of us being prescriptive in legislation. And also the mix of the types of housing that we have. I think we want to make sure that we're not building, a ton of housing that is more for the upper echelon of taxpayers in Vermont, to the detriment of middle and lower income Vermonters. Just wondering what you thought about that.
So let me, thank you. Those are good questions. Let me parse it because there are really two different questions there. On the first one, when we originally proposed this, I've forgotten whether it was 40% or 50%, but we did have a minimum requirement that the project needed, the square footage of the project, the building square footage needed to be 40 or 50%. I've forgotten which it was, housing. And I'm very comfortable with that. I'm not quite sure why the Senate took that out, but they did. And I think it's simply that they wanted to be as flexible as possible about this program, which in general I support. But because I think housing is my priority in this instance, although I'm a strong supporter of economic development and of other sorts, I'm comfortable if that were to go back in. And honestly, I'd be more comfortable with you doing it than I think VEPC needs specific direction about how they would write that up. So the reason why we didn't go for more than 40 or 50% is because in many communities, you want the first floor to be commercial, to be retail or what have you, might have apartments upstairs, that kind of thing. There may also be a project where you've got a commercial user who needs space and where you want to make sure you're addressing that user's needs and so forth and so on. So that on that one. On the other piece, though, I do not think you should have specific income limits on this. And there are a bunch of reasons. One of them is simply that's another layer of complexity in the entire project. It's another layer of review. And then you also have the question then of, if you're requiring a certain level of affordability, okay, who's going to make that judgment? And I know that the VEPC staff has said to me point blank, that's not their expertise. They don't want to be responsible for judging eligibility, and they don't want to be responsible for ongoing years of having to then, check in every year. Are you continuing to meet the affordable covenants? So there's the complexity of the adding to all the additional information you need to then provide as a developer in the application process the municipalities provide, but then the ongoing administration of it gets more complicated as well. And again, going back to my very first slide, we're trying to keep this simple. So that's one. The second is I'm a real believer that we need housing at every tier. I know I was interviewing at one point, doing market analysis less than a year ago, and I was interviewing the CEO of a major institution I will not, just for confidentiality, won't raise. And he had come in from out of state, and he said it took him more than a year to find a house, and he's got to be one of the higher paid people in his county, and that the house he got was much less of a house than the house he had sold in the state he had come from, and how frustrating that was for him. And it's not that I'm as sympathetic to his needs as I am to lower income people. I'm not, but it illustrates the gap in the market is pretty broad. And to the extent that we are allowing even subsidizing, if you will, that's the wrong term, using this tool to pay for infrastructure that supports higher end housing, if that allows people to move out of, more moderate priced housing into that housing they'd like, you're opening those units up. We need more units. We just need more units statewide. And absolutely, the higher end housing is not my priority, but the complexity of trying to restrict it is, I think, not worth the benefit. And there is also, let me just say one other thing, there is the point that this still requires there to be an agreement between the municipality and the developer. And if the municipality looks at this and says, why are we going to, use this mechanism for this high-end housing you can build anyway, because they've got the incentive to capture those taxes too. So I think there's some built-in kind of self-incentives here for municipalities. So I would not restrict that.
Good, thanks. One more thing. What do you, we've been batting around a little bit, the thought of providing another tool would be tax stabilization instead of going to bond or any other means, and your thoughts on that?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about that one, and there's a lot of merit to the tax stabilization concept. But understand that it really gets at different things. This is very much focused on infrastructure and hard construction costs. Tax stabilization is focused on the operating costs of a building once it's built. And it indirectly helps, and I want to be very clear and acknowledge this, it indirectly helps the capital side, because if you stabilize the taxes, you have increased the net operating income. That in turn, the way buildings are valued increases its value, which means the developer can finance more. So yes, there is a nexus there. But the tax stabilization gets a little bit complex in that the way it's done in the state. So I think it would take careful thought about how you craft the legislation. The way it's done in Vermont and in most places is that you've got a baseline and you either have no increase in taxes for a period of time, or it steps up in percentages or whatever you do, but it's based on percentages in any event. In this case, you heard me testify earlier that the mechanism here, there reaches a point where you're going to be able to fix a dollar amount rather than a percentage of retention, a dollar amount. And the same would be true if you think about tax stabilization. If you're going to stabilize a developer's taxes, then whatever that initial stabilization amount actually, I think, is what I would argue you would want to fix, because that's the amount. When you think about a lender, and I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but when a lender looks at this, and when I think about the 3-year tax stabilization that was included in Act 181 last year for flood areas, that is absolutely a benefit, but it doesn't help the value of the building at all. It doesn't help them finance anymore because it's too short term. A lender is going to look at that and say, okay, 3 years from now, the net operating income is going to decrease, the value is going to decrease, and thus our loan to value ratio is not going to be as strong. And so you need to have a longer period of time to actually affect the capital side of the whole way this development works. And if you've got a longer period of time, if you do traditional tax stabilization, you may be stabilizing more than you need to. So what you would do, it seems to me, is stabilize a dollar amount. The lender values the building. It has to be long enough, probably 10 years at least, long enough the developer, the lender says, yes, I will take that into account in valuing this property. But they don't need to have increasing savings. As taxes increase over time, they should be able to pay those increased taxes, whatever they are, because they've gotten the value in year one out of the dollar value of the stabilization. I don't know if that made sense. That was a lot to throw at you. But it's complicated. I think it's worth considering. And honestly, I'd be happy to come back next legislative season to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I think that we'll invite you back if we have more questions. We appreciate that you have language that you provided, and you can send it to the committee. That would be.
We will do that. I will do that for sure. Good.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I'm very happy to come back anytime.
Jess, are you with us?
Hi, here I am.
Hello, good to see you.
Nice to see you too. And thank you for letting me participate by Zoom today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be traveling to Newport later this week, so the ability to limit my time on Vermont roads this week is much appreciated. So good afternoon, everyone. For the record, I'm Jessica Hartleben, and I am the Executive Director of the Vermont Economic Progress Council. I did speak to you earlier in the session about the Spark bill, and today I come to the committee to talk about S-127. I have presented in both Senate Finance and Senate Economic Development. So I hope to provide some commentary about what you've heard today, and also to address some of the questions that you have raised that were similar questions to ones that I was asked in Senate Economic and in Senate Finance. So firstly, VEPC is really excited to be part of the housing solution to address the housing crisis in our state. And we look forward to working with the House to make sure that this program is successful. We would offer the following for the committee to consider. VEPC currently monitors TIF districts in housing projects that we believe we can continue to do so with the passage of the CHIP bill. To date, TIF districts have created over 2,100 units of new housing. These projects have been in communities like South Burlington, St. Albans, and Hartford. TIF, in our experience, has also served as a catalyst to create housing outside of those TIF boundaries. The city of Winooski is an example of this. And if you would like to get further information about the housing that's been created, I would encourage you to look at the recently filed TIF report that VEPC provides to the legislature each April. And I would also be more than happy to come and talk to you about that at another time. From VEPC's perspective, CHIP provides yet another tool for municipalities to build out necessary infrastructure needs that will meet the housing crisis that many of our rural towns and communities are experiencing throughout the state. One of the comments that I heard in the Senate was that VEPC staff would be making decisions. And I think it's important to remember and also to note that there are 2 VEPC staff members, and we do not make decisions to create TIF districts, nor would we create CHIP districts. We do not actively market the TIF program, and we would not be actively marketing a CHIP program. Nor would we advocate for specific proposals put forth by the administration or by the Let's Build Homes group. As the executive director, I see my responsibility to provide information to legislative committees such as yours when asking questions around administrative and programmatic issues. It's important for you all to remember that VEPC is an independent council of 11. And they include your very own Representative Abby Duke and Senator Wendy Harrison. The VEPC Council reviews and makes decisions based on information that VEPC has been provided. We have multiple partners that review the information with us so that we can provide this information to the council to make informed decisions. We work with the Department of Tax PVR division. We work with the Agency of Natural Resources, VTrans, and any other stakeholders that would be necessary to make these very important decisions. Our 11-member council has seasoned professionals that have diverse and vast expertise on local, national, and international levels. The council has decades of experience in residential and commercial real estate development, municipal and state government, banking and finance issues. They are former RDC directors and they're small business owners. Additionally, VEPC contracts using economic and policy resources, which the president is Jeff Carr, who is the administration's economist. And Jeff provides a thorough review, analysis, and commentary of all of the data, supporting documentation, and projections that are submitted by the municipality from the point of fiscal viability. Economic and policy resources also reviews issues related to market viability of the private development plans that the municipalities work with developers to create, and those are contained in the TIF application from the municipality for our review. VEPC encourages this committee to also not underestimate the ability of small towns to utilize and administer the CHIP program. We heard this point before in other committees, not just this committee, but that the small towns do not have the capacity to administer this CHIP program. VEPSI has been in contact with several municipalities that are very small, 1,000 folks or less, that are very excited about the CHIP program. Many of our rural towns have projects in mind that have otherwise stalled for decades. And this tool will finally allow these projects to move forward that will serve communities for future generations to come. CHIP provides some long-term stability also in these very turbulent times. TIF enables Vermont to prioritize high-dollar, high-impact infrastructure projects without the reliance on federal funds. As we've seen recently, relying on federal programs puts our communities at risks when there are seemingly endless changes in federal priorities. While there are many federal programs Vermont municipalities currently use to fund projects of scale, relying solely on federal funding is not a sustainable strategy. Excuse me. Lastly, I know that you've heard in the committee and in joint hearings regarding federal tariffs that cash flows for businesses, which include our builders and creators of our housing, and most importantly, for the municipalities, is going to be an issue. It is now, and it's going to continue to be a significant issue in the near and long-term future. VEPSI has consistently heard from municipalities that there are significant financial barriers that exist to create housing in Vermont. And VEPSI looks forward to working with the legislature to administer a tool that municipalities will be able to use to achieve what I think is our common goal here, which is to provide a necessary and immediate relief to the housing crisis. I heard a question from Chair Marcotte about one of the reporting requirements, and I just want to end my comments before taking questions with VEPSI was actually the myself was the person who recommended to Senate Finance on the reporting requirements to have a 10-year reporting requirement, sort of the comeback and sort of evaluate. And the reason for that is that the creation and planning of these projects can take 2 to 5 years. In our recent TIF district, and if David's still in the room, he could probably talk about this as well. The city of Rutland, it took about 2 to 3 years to do the planning. But the projects, one of the projects had been 50 years in the making. So to say that we need to come back in 5 years to provide aggregate data about whether this program has been successful or not is not realistic from VEPSI's standpoint based on the TIF data that we have. We need to be able to allow the municipalities to work with the developers to create projects. And then once those projects have been created, you need to allow the municipalities to be able to build out the infrastructure so that the infrastructure can be created first before any development is then created. And it's only when the development is created that the increment would be generated to pay back the debt that the town has taken on, or whoever the sponsor is in the CHIP Act. So in order to bring back the data to the legislature to review in 10 years to take an evaluation of the project, that seemed like a more reasonable time frame. In addition, VEPSI will be providing yearly reports, just like we do now for the TIF districts, about the statutory requirements that are outlined relating to how TIF projects are moving along. And there is some very detailed requirements currently in the CHIP statute about what you would like to see VEPSI bringing back to you so that we can make administrative or procedural recommendations as we see these projects moving forward. So with that, I'll welcome the opportunity to answer any questions that you might have and leave it to you.
Questions for Jessica? I guess I'll ask about the law versus rulemaking. I know you the law is pretty general on a couple of areas, leaving everything to VEPSI for rulemaking. And I'm curious if you have significant feelings in that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that VEPSI has the expertise based on the years of doing the TIF program. And this is supposed to be a more efficient and easier program to administer. So I think that VEPSI is capable of making rules that the municipalities can use to be able to build out these infrastructure projects. I think having the flexibility to be able to do that is going to be successful. And that we want to make sure that we're not creating rules that will create barriers for infrastructure projects to be created in municipalities. And we realize that every municipality, whether you live in the southwest corner of Vermont or the northeast corner of Vermont, those infrastructure projects are going to look a lot different. So we cannot have a one size fits all for this program. We need to have the flexibility to address the needs of the communities, and we need to rely on our communities and trust our communities to make decisions that will be best for their communities. And we have the guardrails in place to do that. The communities need, in some cases, to bond if they're going to be going out to get infrastructure funds. So they would need to have public voting. And then VEPSI has to evaluate the projects just like we do now. So I can see that we would be taking some of the rules from TIF and we would be applying them to the CHIP program.
And just to follow up, when we look at that, is that the full council is doing the rulemaking or the staff do the rulemaking? How does that work?
Yeah, so currently how rulemaking works, we are in the process of updating the TIF rule right now. The VEPSI staff works with the Department of Tax through PVR. We have submitted for comments to PVR. We've submitted for comments with the state auditor's office. And then we also submit for comments to all of the municipalities that currently have TIF districts. And then my understanding with the TIF rule is that it then has to go through the LCAR and ICAR process. I don't think that from an administrative perspective and from an efficiency perspective to address the immediate crisis that we have, that would be an efficient process. I think that using a rulemaking process similar to what the agency used for the SIP and CRRP process would be a more efficient and better use to address this crisis situation. And then we can evaluate it from there. My hope is that we would be able to put this program online by January 1st of 26 if the statute were to be passed in July.
Okay, so what I heard from you is rulemaking can be time consuming. And we need to make sure that we're not setting the program up to be stuck in rulemaking for a long period of time.
That's correct. I wouldn't want this to be stuck in rulemaking for 5 years because I would have nothing to come back to report to you because no projects would be created.
And then a last question we had an email from Hartford, I believe, asking for changes to the current TIF to be able to say first or last incurrence of debt because of a VEPSI lawyer reading of the rule. Is that
Right.
something that truly needs to be changed, or is that something that there was a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation?
No, we did propose that in the administration made some requests for changes to the TIF statute. And my understanding is that none of those changes, with respect to the TIF statute, were put forth in either the House bill or the Senate bill. So at this point, there are no changes that are going to be made to the TIF statute.
Right,
And
but
then-
my question is there? Sounds like there was a reinterpretation of the current law to require different language, and is that?
Right. We did-
misunderstanding or?
No, there's no misunderstanding there. There was a request by the administration for, are you talking about the ban, about a bond anticipation note being a first incurrence or a last incurrence of debt? Is that what the statute, your email is about?
Yes.
Right. So I've also heard from the town manager. I wasn't prepared to address that particular issue right now, but I can pull up that email. I mean, I think what I would prefer to do is, if the committee is willing to take up issues relating to the TIF statute as a whole, in addition to the concern that Lori Hirschfield of the town of Hartford had presented, is that I would like to make those comments back to the committee in writing, because if the committee is willing to take up this particular issue, then I think we should also consider taking up the other issues. I wouldn't want to piecemeal the changes in the TIF statute. I'd either want to just leave it alone,
Yep,
leave the
that's
TIF
fair.
statute as the way it is, or have a full conversation about changes that we would like to see to the TIF statute. And I'm fearful of frankly having that conversation this late in the session, because I don't want it to impede
Yeah,
or
no, that's
delay.
perfectly fair. That's perfectly fair.
Yeah.
Mike, you have a question?
Yeah,
Or not? There you
a
are.
couple.
Yep.
I guess I don't think I said anything about a 5-year time period on the report. I think I think it was just, I want to make sure that the date of the report comes in prior to the session starting, instead of in January 15th. I'd rather see the report in December. That's
Okay.
all I was getting at.
I'm sorry, Rep. Mark. I think that the Senate actually had initially said a 5-year, come back in 5 years. So yes, we do get the information in August from the Department of Taxes. So we could.
December 1 would be our date. Like, that would be a perfect date for us, December 1.
Well, even the 15th is okay.
Yeah, I think December 15th would be a better day, only because we also file, so we don't get the information from the Department of Taxes until August 1st. We then also have to do a veggie report, I believe, in September. I'd have to confirm that, but December 15th would be great for the program manager and I to be able to get that report to you. And we may not have a lot, honestly, to get to you in the first few years of this project. But if you want the 10-year review by December 15th of 2034, then
Yes.
that would be acceptable.
Okay, good. It's just that, I mean, right now, currently, and I don't know what it's going to be like in 10 years, but currently there's a longer period of time where we can ask for legislation to be drafted, because it'll be the start of a new biennium. But along with that comes problems, because we have new people coming in all the time, and there's always a request of legislative counsel to draft language. And so this would provide an ability for leg counsel to work on something if there was something needed. That's
Sure. Nope, that's fair.
okay. I think another thing that I saw was that VEPSI wasn't going to provide the okay, that it would be staff, so it would be you.
No, we took that out. I specifically testified in Senate Economic and in Senate Finance pretty definitively that it is not the responsibility of the VEPSI staff to make any decisions.
Well,
That
and
is,
I agree with you. I just,
Yeah.
I saw that in the slide, and so I wanted to make sure that I asked that question. I want to be sure that
No.
it's the board that's providing
Yeah.
that. 'Cause I know we talked about that before.
we
Um,
did.
Yeah. Also, in the audits, I had just asked the question of Representative Kimball and Burkhart to think about.
Mhm.
But should we, would it make sense that you would consult with Department of Taxes? In, you know, the every year looks at what's going on? Does that make
So-
sense or not?
That would be a question better suited for the Department of Tax. My work with the Department of Tax is that they help with the valuation. I don't know that they would be the ones to do to review an audit.
Well, I'm not asking them to review it, but that you're still doing, I mean, it's still in your bailiwick, but you could consult with them if you had questions.
Right, we do that now. We
Okay.
work with PVR regarding the parcels and the valuation of the parcels. That's really the limit of PVR. They provide us with the increment that's generated. So, and they work with the municipalities, and then the municipality actually certifies that the parcels and the values are accurate, and they do that each year. And then PVR and VEPSI receive that document from the towns. So I think I'd want to hear from tax to see if there would be any changes, but to what we currently do, I don't see any problem with that.
Okay. And you talked about rulemaking. The other two instances you were talking about, was that expedited rulemaking?
So it wasn't I'm not sure if it was expedited rulemaking.
Could you get us can you get us the information of how that went about? So that,
About how CRRP, you mean? How rulemaking was made in CRRP? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I agree with you. I don't want to wait 5 years for this. I think if we can do it and get it started in January of next year, that's great. But we've got to understand how we get there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I can get you that information. I know that I can just tell the committees that in CRRP and CIP, ACCD created the rules, and then there was it had to do there was some drive-by that happened with JFO, where JFO looked at it. But it also, brushes up against if you give the authority of VEPSI to create the program, then we are capable of creating the program. And, we could provide you the rules, but it would be up to VEPSI to be able to administer and create the rules for the program. And we could consult with others to do that.
Yeah. Okay. If you can just get us how
Yeah.
that was done, and
Sure.
if it's something that we can go along with, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And one last thing, the language in the bill right now is very broad.
Yeah.
When it's talking about projects, and it just talks about housing component.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, I suppose, a municipality could want a lot of commercial projects to go on, and they create one small little piece of housing that would follow the language in the law. So I think we want to make sure that what we're doing here is creating housing, And that's the main focus. And then any ancillary commercial is fine. But we want to make sure that, and I don't know how we write that in, but I think that's our intent. And I just want to make sure, or maybe you can think about how we develop that.
Right. I think your primary intent right now is to create housing. And I think having the focus be on housing would be fantastic. I've looked at other states about how they've used housing and how they've defined housing. The state of Minnesota, most states want to steer away from, unless they have housing authorities managing their TIF housing programs, they keep the language broad. And for example, in the state of Minnesota, Minnesota created a workforce housing, and they required the city or the municipality to provide a business that employed, I think in Minnesota it was 20 employees or less, to provide a written statement that the city had a lack of rental housing or single family housing for primary residences, and that had created a barrier to businesses hiring employees. I think the other piece you could consider is that the municipality has to certify that the rental housing vacancy rate in the city was 3% or less during the immediate preceding 2-year period. I think we can be creative and also maintain the intent of this, which is to address the housing crisis, and that municipalities will hear that loud and clear, and that VEPC, when talking to municipalities about their planning, are going to see that if the project is only one unit of housing and multiple commercial buildings, that is not in keeping consistent with the intent of the statute, and that the council, with the support of your 2 legislative members, are probably going to have a lot of questions about that. I think that these municipalities, especially in our small rural districts, are desperate to create housing.
Okay. I think, David had suggested originally they talked about 40 or 50% of the project had to be housing. Would that work for you?
So when we get into percentages of housing, I get concerned around the ongoing administration and monitoring of that. And I would not want a municipality that maybe the municipality, in order for a project to pencil out, needs to create 30% of housing, and they have a business that is looking to move to or relocate to their area, and they need to provide some infrastructure for that. And that if 30% of the creation of new primary housing units that would support that business development makes that 30% of housing pencil out, that's 30% more housing than they had prior to the CHIP program before. And that may spur additional housing for that community in the future. I just really want to put some trust in our municipalities that they know what is best for their communities. And when we start regulating percentages, that we are creating barriers that are based on fear and not based in addressing the crisis. I think you
Okay.
also have a VEPSI council that is gonna, take the intent of this program very seriously. And may not, that may not approve a project, probably wouldn't approve a project because it probably wouldn't make it to the council. Because we have guardrails in place that require us to follow the intent of the legislature.
Okay. I also know the politics that go
Of
on in
course.
building as well, so we're trying to facilitate something that's broad, but also that's not so broad that it could create things that we don't want to create. So it's a fine line I think we all have to walk.
Absolutely. I don't envy your position at all.
Okay,
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you
That's all I have.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate the in-depth conversation. I don't see other questions in the room. Everybody feels. Okay, well then, I think we are done for the day, committee. We start again tomorrow morning. We pick up with the same bill, S-127, with a number of other folks testifying, so we can continue to be thinking about this and ask more questions of folks tomorrow.
thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.